up early in the spring. First thing to get green leaves in the spring. You're getting tired of winter and you're driving along. Well, the things are starting to green up out there. Isn't that nice? It's the barberry. Okay? And has the ability to photosynthesize in a broad range of light conditions. You can have it in a shady yard, you can have it in a sunny yard, and it will thrive. It will change the soil conditions to suit itself. It will has no natural enemies.
Who would want it though?
Where was it?
Well, you know, it's one of those hedge. Was originally brought here as sort of the natural fence.
The farmers loved it.
The farmers loved it because it made for a natural fence. And then it holds on to that green color and then turns red very late in the season, so it's one of the last things to drop its leaves. Produces a red berry that has an aesthetic appeal, if you will. And so
It looks like.
Where was it brought from?
here it is.
Huh?
Where
Well,
was
they
it
actually
brought
brought it here in the early 1900s because people used to plant European barberry. The European barberry is the alternate host for wheat rust. So it was killing hundreds of thousands of acres of wheat across the country. And just as a real quick aside, to get rid of the European barberry, they used the first herbicide that was used in this country. They would put 50 to 200 pounds of salt on every barberry plant. Can you imagine putting 200 pounds of salt on a plant?
Is that what it took to kill it?
Yeah, it's a tough little plant. That's why. The other thing, besides what Tom said, besides hedges, like when I moved into my old farmhouse, they planted it underneath every window in the house. I pretty much made it burglar-proof. No burglar in his right mind. I don't care if he's flying on a crack, it's going to be going through that. So I'll tell you what, we're going to go through a quick version of the talk so we can get to lunch. And Tom and I are going to do our traditional tag team, which means they'll be disoriented at times. So Charlotte, can you pop the lights? Oh, maybe leave one on.
No, it's really nice back here.
Stands out.
Okay, it really stands out. So like I said, I don't have a name tag. I'm Jeff Ward. And that's Tom Worthley. And we want to give credit to Scott Williams, who's in my department, but is also adjunct to UConn.
And Scott really was the person who was instrumental in doing the tick research here, the tick and mouse research here. He's was quite quite thorough in all of that.
So we point a lot of fingers, so we'll look through this. I just look through these first couple. This is just the long version. Oh, whoops, let's go back one. So what we're just going to do is we're just going to talk a little bit about Lyme disease because I wasn't here earlier. I don't know if they've touched any other ones. The impact of deer, which also has part of it of the invasive species like barberry. We're going to talk about deer invasive and altered landscape and then how to control them. Next. I love this cartoon. I don't know if anybody else reads the paper anymore, but I still read the paper. It's Big Fuzzy, which is a little sarcastic, goes, "Welcome to the previews for the new horror movie. Be prepared to scream. Napwork Films presents It Came From Connecticut, The Face of Evil." How scary is that? I don't see anything there. That's why it's scary. It's Deer Tick, the movie. How many people here, I assume everyone here's had Lyme disease, how many people saw the tick that bit them? So it's like 80–90% of the people here never saw the tick that bit them, and that's usually the case. Next. Pass. What's interesting is for all of the arthropod, let's think of insects, everything is really small. Arthropod-associated disease in the United States, 75% of them are Lyme disease of the cases in the U.S., which is kind of scary. Next. And here's some of the tick-borne diseases on what's kind of scary where we live at. Oh yeah, we're in a hot spot for anaplasmosis. We're in a hot spot for babesiosis. Really in the hot spot for Lyme disease. We have a little bit of ehrlichiosis. We're sort of right on the edge of Rocky Mountain spotted fever. We get a little bit. Luckily, we don't have tularemia here. What we do have now, we have, what's it, Powassan virus, which is the really scary one because you can get infected 2 hours after being bitten by a tick. Most people never get symptoms, but if you do get symptoms, it's 10% fatal.
What's it called?
Powassan.
That's up in New York, isn't it? That's what
Yeah, well, we found the ticks here down on the coast. infected with Powassan virus.
A deer tick or a?
Deer tick.
And that Flossin, can you spell it?
Powassan?
EN, I believe.
Ian? If you get it close, Google always spelled correct, so that's a great thing. And this is probably a lot of you are aware of, we always put this up here because not everyone has always seen this. Lyme disease cases have been steadily increasing, but the majority, these are reported cases. Most cases are never reported. Like with my physician, when I go in, if I've got a tick, you know, I know it's been in me for a little while, he said, Jeff, I'm not going to bother testing because I know you work in those areas. So I go on antibiotics. I mean, I've had Lyme disease twice. And, you know, you just don't want to keep coming down with it because we've been talking about earlier, there's a lot of associated problems.
Of interest, just in my observation, the Lyme disease was first discovered with somebody from Lyme, why it has its name. Lyme, Connecticut is also one of the areas in the state of Connecticut that has the oldest and most extensive barberry infestation.
That's a great story. The woman who led the drive to have Lyme disease recognized as a real thing, they went to her house a couple of years ago and realized she is surrounded by some of the densest barberry you've ever seen in your life. All the woods around it. Next. So did you guys cover the Lyme disease cycle? I apologize, I got here late this morning.
No.
Yeah, I just wanted to cover this, and I'm actually a forest ecologist, and Tom's a forester, so we're not entomologists or medical entomologists with Gobert. But the eggs hatch in the spring, and the larvae come out. The larvae are really small. They are not infected with any diseases. It doesn't transmit from the females into the eggs. They feed in the summer, actually like right now, and then they actually overwinter.
They're feeding on
Yeah, they're, you know what, that's a key thing. They're feeding on mice and birds, and especially mice, chipmunks, small rodents. Those are the reservoirs of Lyme disease. They can actually have action infections, so when the ticks feed on those small mammals, they pick up the spirochetes, and the spirochetes are then inside the ticks and then potentially could infest us. So they're born without the spirochetes, but then they get infested. Then once they feed, they actually overwinter until next spring. In May, June, into July is when they do the feeding. That's when most people actually get infected with Lyme disease because the nymphs are small. You don't see them. I'll show a picture of them later. Then after they feed, they drop off, and then the adults feed in late summer, early fall. And the adults are pretty big. Usually you'll see an adult. They're big enough you can see, so people rarely get infected from adults. And successful females of them lay the eggs. Next. Here's what I said, most people tend to get it in June or July. That's when the nymphs are feeding. Those are smaller, you can't really see them. I'll show you a picture of one in a second. Next. All right. Pretty hard to pick that up. That's what most of us have gotten infected from. And unless you're lucky and you have, I don't know the name of it, I tend to get a little bit of a red spot whenever I get bitten by a tick. So I usually know it's there. Unless you get that reaction, you have no idea it's even on you. And I don't care if you inspect yourself in the mirror and have your spouse check your back. It's just going to be tough to pick up. Next. The good thing about Lyme disease is there's very little transmission in the first 48 hours. If you get it in the first 24 hours, there's no transmission of the spirochete. Powassan virus is different. So vigilance is really important, is to check yourself in front of a mirror, a full-length mirror. Check yourself. And where you can't see, you know, have somebody else check it. If you've got kids, check them. So, well, like I said, because they're so small, we just tend to miss them. Next. You know, there again, there's the adult. It's kind of hard to miss those. There's the larva. I mean, it's just a really small little critter. If it's in the hair or part of the body you can't really see, or if you're like me and you got freckles everywhere, I mean, it just sort of looks like one of your freckles.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Oftentimes we hear about deer ticks and wood ticks, and
Well, deer tick is the old name. Officially, we're supposed to call them black-legged ticks now.
okay, are they the same type? Is it just the different
I've
parts of the larvae?
I've never heard the term wood tick. There's dog ticks, and deer ticks have this black patch with sort of a reddish color. Dog ticks have like little wavy lines through them. Dog ticks transmit, let's see, it's Rocky Mountain spotted fever, I believe. And then if you live right on the coast, they'll occasionally pick up Lone Star ticks, which will just have a white dot.
So the real little ones aren't the deer ticks, it's just the larvae of the
Deer tick.
of the bigger tick.
Well, there's 3 stages, like I said, they hatch as larvae, and you don't have to worry about those because they don't have any infections. It's the nymphs, and this is a nymph.
The nymph. Okay.
Those are carrying the spirochetes, this causal agent of Lyme
Okay.
disease.
So you're the larvae.
No, it's the same tick.
It's the same
wood
tick.
tick is
Okay.
different.
Well, I don't know what a wood tick is.
Or the dog tick is.
Dog tick is completely different. It's a different species.
So the wood tick is comparable to the dog tick.
I don't know. I've never heard that. Have you ever heard of wood tick?
I've heard of the phrase wood tick, I always associated with the dog tick.
And
Okay.
I
As
think most
opposed to
people
the deer.
use the same term, wood tick and dog tick, to
Yeah.
describe.
Okay,
I don't-
but the dog tick is going to have the wavy white lines right here on a like little shell on its back. And deer tick is going to be a solid color.
Okay.
But here's the practical thing for me. A tick is a tick is a tick. And, you know, you want to hold them all.
I just thought there were 2 different types of species. There was a bigger one and a smaller one, but now what I'm understanding is the nymph is the same, it's just a smaller version,
Right,
or
all
younger
ticks,
version.
all ticks have a four stages in their life. They have eggs, larvae, nymphs, and adults.
Okay, all right.
So, no, it's a great question. Yeah.
I was just gonna say that, that talk after lunch has a lot of pictures of ticks and
Okay,
talks
good.
about
So we
these,
can-
don't,
Oh, okay.
don't stress
Okay.
over
Good,
it.
we'll flip through this, we'll go through the medical one part then really quick. So we'll flip through these. I just want to say there is a lot of information. The experiment station, if you go online, you can download
Is
the
that,
tick
is that
handbook.
what you were showing us out there? Is that handbook there?
No, that's
Oh.
completely different. This is how to control invasives. This is tick management like in backyards. I can't remember, the lady asked a question about the wood chips around the perimeter.
That was-
Yeah, this has everything in the world you wanted to know about that.
I think that I think I might have put a link to that on our website too, I think.
And I have a link in my talk.
Oh, excellent.
Excellent. And actually, if you want to be really scared, go to the CDC's Tick Diseases of the United States. You'll never leave your house. Next. I'll tell you what, just for time, I'll do this really quick. I just want to say, deer are actually one of the contributing factors. Not so much in the tick life stage, although large mammals are important for adult ticks because they transport them around the landscape and they provide a blood meal for them. Well, what deer really do is they alter the landscape when you have too many deer to allow the invasive species to come in. When you have the invasive species, that creates a habitat the ticks like. It's sort of like building, Disney World for ticks by doing it. So deer eat everything. They eat all the seeds on all the native stuff, and they can disperse seeds of alien species, invasive species across the landscape. Next. And one of the things here in Connecticut is back in 1900, believe it or not, they actually thought there were 12 deer. Not Sanders deer, they thought there were 12 deer in the state. And now DEP, actually they quit doing estimates because it got too political. They said 80,000. Well, we know that cars kill 15,000, hunters kill 15,000, that's 30,000 deer a year. So unless you think hunters and cars are killing half the deer every year, we have a lot more than 80,000 deer. It's pretty amazing. Next. And here's what happens when you have too many deer. If you look at this understory, there's nothing growing except where you can see green. You want to guess what that green is? That's an early barberry infestation. It's one of the places Tom and I first worked at. Next. But they can also cause other problems. Luckily, ferns don't cause a problem with ticks, but you shouldn't be able to see 100 yards through the woods. Go ahead, next. And the deer have a real impact on wildflowers, so that's another reason why. It's a human disease thing, but I think most of us just love natural things, right? And by eating all the wildflowers, that's another way you can emotionally attach people. And also invasive species, a paper we're just working on right now. Invasive species not only harbor the Lyme disease spirochete, but they shade out and outcompete all of our native species. And I think we all have seen wildflowers.
And the biodiverse environment is going to be a healthy environment also, for any number of reasons.
And there's one of the reasons. That was a great segue. Next, native pollinators. So it just goes through this really quick. I probably should have cut this part out. We actually went out and collected over 500 deer pellet samples. Next.
That's what that is.
Yeah, those are all, we put them in the fridge for 3 months. We found plants growing out of them. Next. And we actually found 11,000 seedlings coming out of those deer pellets. Go ahead, next. Here's the scary thing. We found that deer move invasive alien species, or invasive species. Majority of seeds we found growing out of deer poop were actually not native. And a lot of these were things which can make good habitat for ticks. Next. Skip past that one. Yes, so we're just going through this. Things like autumn olive, multiflora rose, wine raspberry. See, some of these are good because they provide good habitat for ticks. Some of these are also good because they provide good habitat for small mammals. And you need those small mammals to be able to sustain the tick population. Next. And vine honeysuckle, which doesn't really affect the ticks. Next. So why should you care? And I had to promise my wife at dinner to get her to stand in the middle of this barberry. So why should you care about these invasive species? And we're going to give some other reasons. It's one of the things when you talk with people in your towns or around your thing, they're going to say, well, yeah, but we'll just make the trails wide and that'll get rid of the problem. Well, actually, the ticks are going to keep coming, so we need to have multiple arguments to tell people why we want to control these things. We definitely want to use that Lyme disease link, but we want different people, you reach them different ways, right? You all have a different audience.
Here's the other thing from an investment standpoint. Yeah, keep the trails wide. You have to go back and you have to do that every single year because the plant is going to grow where the space is. If you control the plants altogether, you have to go back and re-widen the trail for a long, long time.
Well, one of the things is earthworms are great in our gardens. Earthworms aren't native in our woods. And where we have a lot of invasive species, especially barberry, we have twice as many earthworms. And why do we worry about that? Next. Well, earthworms eat all the litter, which that soil litter, all the litter is all the weeds and small twigs. They eat all that. Next. And if you go out underneath barberry, this is what a forest with barberry looks like. Underneath it, you don't see the leaves in the end of summer. You just see dirt. Next. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is a shot of some of these worm droppings that have been castings, I guess is what we call them, that have been washed down over the surface of the soil to collect in one spot, and you get some gully erosion as well. That has occurred in what should be a non-erosive setting, a forest floor setting. The organic material should be absorbing the water and getting it into the ground. The lack of organic component to the surface of the forest soil is allowing for some erosion to take place that would take place normally. And then that in turn results in chemical and sediment pollution to waterways.
Which is another important reason when you're talking to people about why we want to control invasives. We're concerned here primarily with tick-borne diseases, but like I say, you reach different people. You can reach people who go fishing by just saying, look, these things are also causing problems in all of our rivers.
This is a process that biologists refer to as a trophic cascade. With one thing doing its thing over here is resulting in a huge impact on a much broader environment.
So let's go. And here's the big one we're talking about here, and I think it's how you reach most people, is where you've got invasive species. We're going to talk about why they increase Lyme disease risk. Next. What's interesting is the states in red are the states where barberry is considered invasive. Look where the concentration of blue dots. That's 1 year's reported Lyme diseases. So there's a pretty good correlation. Next. These are just if anyone is really curious and wants to take a quick camera shot, or you could email us later. We can show you the references to some of these papers. Like I was saying, with Amur honeysuckle increases the risk of ehrlichiosis. And that's what we have going here. So, next one, please. Here's a typical forest with just native vegetation. Every one of these dancing ticks you see represents 10 ticks per acre that are carrying Lyme disease. Next. If we go into a stand with dense barberry, I should point out Scott is 6'8". You gotta find somebody big enough to stand. You don't have 10 ticks per acre, next. You don't have 50, next. You don't have 100, next. I said earlier, you've got 120 ticks per acre. That's 12 times the risk factor, just by having that invasive species rather than the native species. Next. If we go out there and if we treat, if you have a big area, we've done some areas where we've actually treated 20 acres, and there's no way you're going to use a flamethrower for 20 acres. It was actually part of a 100-acre barberry stand, if you can imagine that. A huge area. And smaller infestations, you can use a propane torch. So when we went out there and treated all the invasive species, primarily barberry, next, we found we could reduce that in 1 year down to 40 ticks per acre. We could reduce that risk by 2/3 just by treating invasive. And because barberry have a 2-year life cycle, it then drops back to normal.
Could you go back a couple slides? Real quick. Yeah, that one there. This environment here, while Scott is 6'8", your white-footed mouse down here and all his cousins and friends, this is an ideal environment for them. They're hidden from the predators. They have plenty of low-hanging fruit to eat, and so it's no wonder that that early stage of the tick can so easily find a blood meal on a small furry critter, and so many of them are carrying that spirochete that the ticks pick them up in these environments. Forward.
Are ferns a good thing or not such a good thing for
Ferns,
back?
apparently, we don't pick ticks up in ferns, generally speaking. Unless it's like a wet meadow edge where you've got those taller ferns, we just don't pick them up. And I'm just talking, I'm lucky enough I probably spend 90 days a year out in the field, and we generally don't pick up, you'll pick up 1 or 2 a day, that's just normal for us. But we don't pick up those times what Tom's talking about where, you get 10, 20 ticks in the morning and 10, 20 ticks in the afternoon. It just increases our risk factor of actually being bitten. So for people who didn't like the dancing ticks, which field do you want to go walking in? Next. I forgot that was there. So why? Here's what Tom was sort of talking about a little bit later. Well, one of the possible things are mice. Next. What Tom was saying, that was our original thought, and we still think it's part of it. One of the reasons we didn't actually pick it up in our studies is the areas where we did our initial treatments were about the size of these 2 rooms put together. We think the mice were running back and forth. So we put in those couple of 20-acre ones, and we think mice are going to have something. But even on smaller areas, next, what Scott Williams, the other guy we talked about, is he actually went out there and measured the temperature and humidity in areas with dense barberry, areas without barberry, and areas where we just killed barberry. And the amazing thing, next, is he found out it's the humidity, what we were talking about earlier. Those barberry areas, when you work in them, if you ever go walking out in or multi-floor roads, they're always humid. You always start sweating. It's so humid in there. And ticks like a humid environment. Next. Now we'll skip past this one because it takes like 3 minutes to explain. So there's actually, I thought that one came up next. Yeah, go ahead. I thought it came up automatically. So there's sort of like a deer alien species or invasive species. It's just aliens is a lot neater graphic. And ticks. So they're sort of a triangle. They all come together. Deer clear out all the native species. And because deer don't eat the invasive species, the alien species, like barberry, they're able to grow because they can grow where there's a lot of deer. That invasive species coming in is great habitat for mice and for the ticks, and they sort of do a bioamplification to get in Lyme disease. Next. So this is going through really quick. Are you talking this afternoon about this?
Not about, it's non-Lyme disease, tick-borne diseases, but I do talk about the ticks because they're important.
Okay, so I wanted to make sure I wasn't double checking
No, go wild.
on that part. Okay. Yeah, so this is all from Dr. Kirby Stafford, who is our tick expert. So if you have any questions or if I say something wrong, talk to Kirby. He's the man. He's like the national expert on Lyme disease. So he let me use his slides. And what they're doing is they're looking at a bunch of different ways now of targeting the host to control Lyme disease. White-tailed deer are important because the adults feed on them. Adult ticks need a large mammal.
And
In
they also move them around.
Yeah, and move them around. That's absolutely. And small mammals are important because they're the reservoir. Deer actually are what I'm told, are not a competent reservoir. Though the spirochete can't survive inside a deer. They are naturally able to fight off the infection. But small mammals actually serve as a reservoir of the disease because they'll have active spirochetes in.
Can I interrupt just for a second? I think recently they figured out that birds are a big part of the
Birds are another part, yeah.
spreading it dramatically, I guess, which they didn't think for a while was happening.
Yeah, like I said, it's a lot more complicated picture, and so we're trying to throw it, and that's a great point. I mean, think when we grew up. Did anybody here growing up ever see a deer tick? We saw dog ticks occasionally, right? But we never saw deer ticks.
Dog ticks.
When I first came to Connecticut in '87, I mean, there were deer ticks on the coast, but when I was up in Litchfield County or Hartford County, never saw a deer tick. And now that's some of the worst spots to pick them up. They've been migrating north. Won't get past conspiracy theories, but for whatever reason, they've been moving north.
They're in Canada.
They're in Canada.
I just spent a week north of Toronto, and they have black-leg ticks up there.
I didn't know that. I know Vermont has the second highest incidence of Lyme disease in the country, which is pretty scary. They had no deer ticks at all. So global change and increasing deer herds and birds flying them around, and it's a confusing world. Next. So one of the things he looked at was putting up exclusion on properties, and they were doing not just somebody's yard, they were doing several houses at a time, a big barrier. And I think I'm getting about the right number. I think he said the structures have to be at least 100 feet away from the fence to show an effect, because mice will go back and forth across the fence. But what they found is that when, actually he said 70 meters, that's 200 feet. Holy Moses, that's a big area to fence in. But they were able to reduce the larvae, those are the ones which don't infest us, by 100%. Females aren't laying eggs. Nymphs, those are the ones that usually that we get infected by, because they're small, we don't see them. Able to reduce it by 84%. That's a pretty big thing, but you'd have to basically fence in a neighborhood. So basically a gated neighborhood to keep deer out. Next. They also looked at where, in some places where they went out and shot the deer. Bluff Point was one where they had some incredible, I think the next one shows how many deer they had. They showed the deer density. Yeah, so they had, deer density was 45 deer per kilometer, which is like 100 deer per square mile. So that's like 1 deer for every 6 acres. A lot of us have 1 or 2 acre properties. So if you're living in a neighborhood where we'll say everybody has a 2 acre property, that means 1 deer for 3 houses. One thing, you're not going to have any shrubberies. But there are also, I mean, just imagine that many deer. And if you have that many deer, you're probably going to have that many mice. What's interesting, if you look at the black line, that's the number of human cases of Lyme disease. Right. Yep. Once they reduced the deer density, they had to collapse the deer density. I'm not talking about just a little bit of reduction. They had to lower it down. So now we're talking about 5 deer per kilometer, 10 deer per square mile, which is very, very low. They really dropped, if you look at the solid line, they really dropped the number of Lyme diseases in that neighborhood. But that was, DEP went out there, well, they're DEEP now. They went out there, their entire crew was just shooting deer, which isn't going to happen in most neighborhoods. Next. They've done another one up in Maine where they dropped down the deer. Once they removed all the deer, because the adult ticks need a large mammal to be able to survive, they found no subadults and very few adults, and basically they collapsed the Lyme disease. So one of the things is we've had that increasing deer herd I showed you earlier. The ticks need the high deer density to be able for the adults to survive and be able to reproduce. So that's one component, but there's also the juvenile component. Go ahead.
We mentioned earlier a project in, I think she said Troy or Albany, New York, where they were looking at schoolyards, and just even in the mowed grass there were all these ticks. This could be the solution to that problem, is fencing the schoolyards from deer.
Next. Actually, that'd be a great one. So part, not the entire solution, is reducing deer things. Deer density. Next. But that's pretty political. So we talked about this earlier. Whoops, non-natives, exotics. Next. Well, here's the thing with deer. They can be cute and cuddly. That's a real picture.
Yeah, that's not Photoshop.
Really?
Yeah.
That was actually an orphan deer that they collect the ones that don't have their mothers. The sad thing, only about 5% of those deer ever survive when they release them. Next. But that's not what a forest is supposed to look like. That's an incredibly disturbed habitat. The only thing you can see growing here, there's a barberry, there's a barberry. This is now a barberry stand. This picture was taken 15 years ago. Next. So one of the things we actually looked at is, let's see what happens out in the woods when we put a fence up, because nobody's crazy enough to put a fence out in the woods. Next. I should say we worked with the Aquarian Water Company, Regional Water Authority, and the Nature Conservancy on this. So you have to put up an 8-foot high fence to keep deer away, because they'll jump over fences. Next. And the other thing about fences is you have to maintain a fence. Fences, you can't just put them up and forget about them. They always put up a fence or high maintenance items. Next. What's interesting inside here, we actually got native, this is that summer. We got a lot of native vegetation coming back in. We controlled barberry in both spots. But outside the fence, the only thing we had coming back in, and this is barberry now, because this is, 9 years now. The only good thing you can see popping out for some barberry. You don't see any of the native plants coming back in.
The grass you see probably is Japanese stud grass there.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're right. Next. So that's just some other views, some more recent views of it. So deer have a real thing. What's interesting here, this was Charles Island off of, anyone been to Silver Sand State Park down in Milford?
Yep.
Some have. So this is an island out there that had the equivalent of 750 deer per square mile. I think they had 17 deer on 14 acres out there, so it's more than 1 deer per acre. Unbelievable. And this is a really scary forest from both an invasive standpoint and from a tick standpoint. Invasive. The entire understory was nothing but pure barberry. All the trees were either Ailanthus or Norway maple. I think we found 2 red maples, a sassafras, and a black cherry on 14 acres. All the other trees were Ailanthus. All the vines growing up are invasive honeysuckles. Next. So one of the things are deer. Next. Like I said, this is a very political thing with deer control. So I'm just going to say that should be one component. Next. So what we were talking about out there is this is a project that Tom and I worked on. We actually had a lot of support, both in funding and support from everybody from DWEP, Propane Council, the Nature Conservancy, Aquarian, Regional Water Authority, Providence Water. So we've done this in 4 states now. Joshua's Trust is up here, so I should make sure to mention them. Especially seeing, I think somebody here is involved with them. No? Okay. Next. And this is my canned one, so I always give everybody. So there's a picture of Tom, if you haven't seen him before. And there's Scott, and also Pete Smallage over at Cornell, and our techs were definitely a big part of it. Next. So when we talk about how to control invasives, we're not talking about, well, we did this little study plot, it was 10 by 10, and we went out there and did it. We actually have had 28 study areas in 4 states, 149 plots, and we've treated 122 acres altogether. So I'd like to think between the 2 of us, we have pretty good experience. Next. And we've looked at 50 different treatment combinations. The reason why we looked at so many combinations is we were trying to do 2 things. One, we were trying to find, one size doesn't fit all. when you're doing anything, right? You want to have treatment or alternatives. And the other thing is if you've got a large infestation, you're going to want to treat it different and small. So we were trying to find what was the best thing for different situations that was also cost effective. Because it costs money to do this. Even if it's volunteer labor time, that's still a cost. Next. Like I said, in areas where we had the 100-acre infestation, to get out there and try to do every one of those little plants, we actually, Tom and I did it in one place where it was like this. We did 1 acre. It took 60 hours with a propane torch for 1 acre. That's incredibly expensive. Luckily, we had a grant to pay for it because otherwise you could never afford it. So in an area like this, where we did 20-acre blocks, yeah, we used herbicide. Next. Well, what Tom and I developed, and I'm going to let Tom talk about this, is a 2-step procedure.
As I started to explain out in the field, an initial healthy plant, keep clicking through this one. If you kill the above ground portion by cutting it off, it will resprout. Okay, all of our deciduous species will do that. And so the idea is to cut it off mechanically and then use some other means to kill this secondary growth. And that's generally enough to finish killing off the rest of the plant.
One of the important things there, you can leave it there, is imagine, as you saw out there, those roses out there were what, 3 feet high and 3 feet across? The cool thing, and we were working with barberry, it was 6 feet high and 6 feet across, is once you cut it down and it resprouts, it's not this great big thing. Now you're talking about a small plant that's 1 foot in size. So when a plant's a foot high, if you're using a propane torch, it's a lot quicker. If you are going to use herbicide, now you're treating just a little spot.
And so we tried a variety of different methods for reducing that upper part of the plant. Handheld brush cutters. These would have been like oversized weed whackers, only fitted with one of those metal blades, you know, with the 3 or 4 blades on it. Those are handy. They're easy to sharpen. If you happen to hit a rock or something, and they work very well on something the consistency of barberry or multiflora rose. The brush mower, as long as you don't have a lot of logs and rocks and that sort of thing, why that's an effective way of reducing the above ground portion of the plant. We did some flaming of this nature where we had individual plants that we could walk all around and get it completely girdled. That would generally kill the above ground portion of the plant. If you stood there long enough, you might be able to kill it entirely the first time, but a lot of times we did get sprouts from those as well. And then the controlled burn resulted in some complete killing of the above ground portion, but generally there were sprouts coming back from that as well. And in a couple of spots, we operated one of these FiveElemnt mowers, brush cutting mower with a flail head, and that you know, lots of fun to do, no question about it. And you can cover a big area, but you very often have to spend a little time using a hand tool to get all the ones that the big machine doesn't get. And there was an experimental design associated with this, so we were trying different follow-up treatments to you know, at all these different sites to test the different methods. And so there would have been a control site where there was no second step. There would have been a portion of the site that was treated with a follow-up on the sprouts of a flame torch, and then 2 different herbicide combination or active ingredients, if you will. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in most of your Roundup products, and tricloper is the active ingredient in stuff like brush begone. So the torch is useful, is expensive. That's one of the things that we found out, that if I'm carrying one of those backpack sprayers like the one you saw I had today, and it has a herbicide mix in it, once those sprouts come up, I can walk along and zoop, 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 just a little bit of herbicide on each one, and it goes fairly quickly. If I have to walk through that with the propane, it takes a little bit longer. It's non-chemical. We won't quite say it's organic, but it is non-chemical, but you have to be willing to invest some time in it. And so it is more expensive from a labor standpoint. If you have volunteers, or if you can entice some, you know, some young person to say, hey, you want to go out and use a flamethrower today? Okay, my forest crew can't wait to do this on Monday. You know, so, you can get some work done. You want to make sure you have damp conditions, so that, or some way, means to extinguish any fires that do occur. You know, we're fortunate today that we know that nothing that we flamed out there is going to continue to burn. Go ahead. The herbicide you might use when the clumps are larger than 4 feet tall. Growing in full sun, that full sun is going to be a factor in allowing it to resprout. Where you also have other invasives, where cost is important, where you want to cover as much acreage as possible. This is the big thing you want to be careful of. And in one way, did you do some trials at different times of the season, growing seasons? Yeah. You might want to reflect on whether a timing of application of herbicide makes a difference with it.
The one nice thing with barberry is you can kill it any time of the year. But what's even nicer is barberry has green leaves into October, into the middle of October, when all the native stuff is turned brown. So you can actually go out and treat barberry in the middle of October without killing the native plants. So even if you go out there and spray, you're always going to hit some stuff you don't want to, but if it's brown or yellow, the herbicide doesn't kill it. So that's kind of nice. Next.
But what's happening on foliar herbicides is that the plant is drawing the herbicide down in and killing the roots. Spring ephemerals are called spring ephemerals because they come out in the spring. They're not around in September. You know, barberry is still doing that photosynthetic activity, and so the herbicide will work on it.
So let's imagine in your yard, or if you're in a park, and you've got 35% barberry cover, which the way we do it, most people would think it was 100% cover. We actually go with a little frame, and in between these chairs we would say there's no barberry. So actually every one of these sections here is probably 50% covered by the way we do it, but you guys would say 100%, so that's what we're looking at. You have 40 hours of labor. So do you want to treat 1 acre, 2 acres, 4 acres, or 10 acres? So just think in your own mind what you want to do. And here's the trade-off. Next. If you use these different option treatment combinations, there's how much you can do. If you're going to go out there with a backpack mist blower, you can do 10 acres, but you're going to kill everything. Potentially, you're going to do a lot more damage. If you just go out there and use propane really targeted both times to kill it initially and then kill the resprouts, you're only going to treat 1 acre. So you need to think about those combinations. What we like for most of the times is just cutting it down, mowing it down, and then when you have the small plant, you can just do a real targeted thing. The one nice thing about going out there, if you do the herbicide, is it's once. You might have to go back a second year, and you might have to go back 10 years later. You don't go out every year. So we're not talking about going out there like a lawn care company and treating your yard every 3 months, every year after year. We're talking over 10 years, 3 treatments, and very small little target things. We're not talking about doing the whole area. Next. So just to close here, alien species invasives can be controlled, and controlling deer density in alien invasives reduces the exposure to Lyme disease. I'll tell you when. I want to do it. I want to tell you. Next. So when are they a problem? This is an age-appropriate group for this. So when are alien invasive species a problem? Next. It's when you have too many deer, because remember, the deer eat all the native stuff and allows the invasives to come in. Go ahead. And you have a disturbance, so it allows a lot of sunlight coming in. Next. But it's a little complicated because you can also increase, next. Some of these can also increase at the same time. So it's a complicated story. I said it's age appropriate. My kids did not get this movie at all. Next. Oh, we'll skip over that. That's another scary one for the future. So there's our contact information, and really I think Tom and I would really like to thank you guys for paying attention. Yeah?
I got 3 questions. Is there, considering all factors, is there an optimum time for killing, flame throwing, killing?
Ideally, I tell you what, I would always go out there first and cut it down and get it small. But then to do the follow-up treatment, the ideal time would be right after the leaves get up to full size. Because they have to take all those sugars, those carbohydrates that are stored in the roots, so the plant's at its weakest right then. When those leaves emerge, they start producing sugars. Those sugars go back down to the roots. That gives them starch reserves. Just like, we want to have, I have a little bit too much, but we want a little bit of body fat to give us those reserves for when we get sick. And right when those leaves emerge, that's when the plants are at their weakest.
I'd be concerned about starting a forest fire.
So would we. I don't know what Tom was told. My boss specifically said, Jeff, this is great research. If you put a forest on fire or burn down a house, you're fired. I was explicitly told that. We did almost all of our treatments when it was raining or drizzling.
Do you think a permit from the local fire marshal would be required?
We were told by the state fire marshal that we didn't need one because we're not burning brush. I would still talk with your local town and tell them what you're doing. It's just courtesy. We always talked with folks and just said what we're doing. We said we're doing this when the rain is going on. For me, it's common courtesy not to blow off anybody. If you keep people in the loop, they always feel a lot more comfortable. Yeah.
I have a quick one. Obviously, if we're going to get rid of it, we'd follow your advice and cut it down first.
Yeah.
Now, this is big, thorny. How do you cut it down? Do you have any suggestions with how to get in there and do that? Because it's...
What we do with the brush cutters is I generally have one worker with the brush cutter and another worker following them along with an iron rake. They stand at some distance so they don't get whacked by mistake. But the person will make the cut and the other person will kind of drag away the brush and put it into piles, and and they work through that way. That way they make sure they get all the pieces, all the little stems that are part of that clump. Barberry grows in clumps. It grows from a root collar that's sort of fist-shaped, that's just beneath or right at the surface of the soil. Part of the flaming technique is to try to heat that piece to kill the buds that are in there. And you need to get all the pieces away from it if you're going to be successful.
Okay. Tom had student labor. I work for the state. Believe it or not, some state agencies like the experiment station try to be really cheap. So what we did is we use a brush saw, what Tom was saying earlier. It's not a weed whacker. You got to wear a shoulder harness. It's like 10 pounds. But you don't have a saw blade. You actually have a blade which is sort of like a ninja throwing star. And Tom was the one that turned us on this. So it's sort of like a Vegematic star, like a blender. And what you can actually do, if it's up to 6 feet high, is make sure you're wearing a hard hat, ear protection, and face shield. Is you can walk up and you can lift up and it chews it up like a vegetable thing. If you have a saw blade, it won't do that. And then you just work up and down once or twice, and then you get a path right to the center of the plant.
That's good.
And then you can cut it down. Like I said, he had the labor. We didn't have the labor to do that. So, but that star thing, like I said, you just walk up to it, you lift it up, and you work it back and down, and just chops up, pieces go flying everywhere. That's why you want the full protection. But you get right to the center.
That's a technique I use with multiflora rows, but using a chainsaw instead. Personal protective equipment, of course. Start at the top and kind of whack pieces off until you can get to the base of it and walk it off.
Is there a technical term for that? For example, I have an Echo weed whacker that I could put saw blades on for brush, but I don't know what that star thing is.
Is there a blackboard or whiteboard here?
Yeah, in the back, yeah.
This blackboard behind you.
Oh! Yeah, so the blade actually looks, if you look at brush saw blades, it looks like that. There's another one that looks like this. We found this triangle blade actually works best. One of the problems if you have one that looks like a circular saw blade is the teeth keep hitting rocks. I mean, Connecticut has rocks, and it dulls really fast. This thing, it bounces off the tip, and this is the cutting surface. You could, there's actually a cutting surface on both sides, so theoretically you could flip it over and resharpen it. Because we never hit a rock with a cutting part, we've never had a sharpened one.
Would that work on Russian olive too?
It works on stuff up to about 1/2 inch in diameter, and it works great on bamboo. With autumn olive, you're gonna have to go out there and either use a saw blade or a chainsaw.
Okay.
If you can get past the thorns.
Yeah.
Maybe one more question, because I think they're getting lunch ready. Yeah?
If I went on to Google or the extension service, would it show me close-ups of what a barberry plant looks like?
You can Google it, there's plenty of pictures.
Yeah, just type in Japanese barberry and you'll find all the images in the world.
I'll tell you
There's
what,
an example over there.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just have, just want your opinion. Do you think there is any way to get the pests, deer, mice, to eat the invasive plants? Like, can we sprinkle flavor?
Well, actually, goats will eat it. So if you have a neighbor who has goats.
Pigs will eat it too.
Right to go.
Yeah, but it has, the reason why it's not eaten a lot is that yellow color is actually poisonous. But goats can eat, they have some miracle stomach that they can eat anything. So.
We tried to pass the rumor that you can smoke it, but, you know.
I tried to pass a rumor it cured baldness.
That's great.
Thank you very much.